Hey everybody, today we've got an exciting video. We're actually going to be deploying Proxmox on a dedicated machine. Well, there's a slight nuance there. I'll be installing it on a virtual machine using Hyper-V so that you can follow this video, but the process will look and feel exactly the same as though you were installing it on your dedicated machine. So why are we going to be using Proxmox? Well, I'll tell you the reasons that I use Proxmox, and I'll also go through some of the features they highlight on their website. So the reason I moved to Proxmox from Hyper-V was several-fold, most prominent of which was the community. Hyper-V is quite popular, I've seen it in the workplace, but in terms of home labbing and that support that you're going to get on tap through Reddit and various other forums, nothing seems to come close to Proxmox. Yes, there's ESXi and VMware, however, that requires a license. You can get it cheap for a couple of £100 a year, but still, that's a cost I didn't want to have. Plus, Proxmox is open source. That's right, it installs on top of Debian, and that's one of the reasons I was really attracted to it, kind of supporting that open source movement. What features does it give you? It's more a question of what it doesn't. For what I was looking for, I wanted a solid virtualization platform built on Linux. It uses KVM from Linux, the kernel virtual machine. It has a dedicated backup image, so you can deploy a backup server. It has email security. I don't use that, but it might be a consideration that you want to have for enterprise. Another reason I wanted to use Proxmox over Hyper-V was how friendly it is for consumer hardware. Because it uses a Linux kernel under the hood, you get very granular access to that hardware. So as I was getting deeper into the home lab journey, I wanted to do more advanced things. I've already mentioned before about hardware pass-through, and whilst this is possible on Hyper-V, it's a lot more difficult. Proxmox is typically a few extra lines in a config file and then a couple of clicks in a GUI. In Hyper-V, I was finding I was having to be a PowerShell whiz, and also a lot of the times the options just weren't there because you had to be running enterprise gear such as things like Intel Xeons, and I just didn't have those at the time. Now I've moved to Proxmox, now I do have Intel Xeons in a proper enterprise server. Am I going to go back to Hyper-V? No chance. Proxmox has been absolutely rock solid, and I'd be hard pressed to go anywhere else at this moment in time. So as I mentioned before, I'll be installing Proxmox on Hyper-V so that you that haven't moved to this, don't have a dedicated machine, can still install Proxmox and get yourself familiar with the UI and can join in some of these videos along the route. Once you have a dedicated machine, feel free to go and install Proxmox, and then you'll be right back up to speed with where we are. So just walking through this process, as you begin the install process in Hyper-V, you might be confronted with a blank screen. You just need to hit return on that and it will skip. I think it's just a bug with how it's being virtualized. You will be presented with that message saying there's no KVM support. Now what that means is on a consumer processor, nested virtualization, i.e. a virtual machine inside a virtual machine, isn't supported, or certainly isn't supported on the CPU I've got a 9th gen Intel. But you can just click OK. That error message will go away and you can just continue the process as though you were on a physical machine. So just accept the end user license agreement, and that'll take you on to the next important step. When I first installed Proxmox, I only had a single disk, and that's fine. It just means if that device fails, you will lose your Proxmox installation, and if you don't have a backup, you'll have to do it from scratch. Since then, I've gone away and I've just bought two cheap-ish SSD drives. I think I'm using the MX500s, which are regularly on a sale. They have DRAM on the SSDs, so that helps with the caching, helps with wear out, and ultimately helps with performance. The beauty of that means that I have two drives in a mirror, which means each drive has a copy exact one-to-one of the other drive. So you get better read speeds, and also you get some redundancy. Now, RAID isn't a backup, and you've probably heard that many times, and it's very true. RAID gives you redundancy. If one of those drives fails, your machine will operate, and you can pull out the faulty drive, you can put a new drive in, and you can recreate that mirror. But don't worry, if you don't, you can continue with a single drive. Just understand the limitations, and if you're happy with that, that's fine. If you want to add a drive at another time, you can add a drive to that existing system. So I recommend using ZFS RAID 1, as this will allow you to expand in the future, and ZFS also has many other benefits baked in, such as native compression. You'll then be presented with a network configuration. Now this is pretty straightforward. Typically the default values are correct. What you will want to note is the management interface, especially if you have more than one network interface card on your server. You can choose which one you want to do. Typically the default one is the one you'd choose. On your virtual machine, you're likely only going to have one. However, in Hyper-V you can add as many network adapters as you want, just like we did the external switch from the previous video. You'll be able to specify your IP address here. That's probably going to be allocated through DHCP on your router. Your gateway should be pre-populated and you won't have to change that, but that's effectively the IP address of your router. And then your DNS server. And again, if you're on an ISP router, that's likely going to be pre-populated. So once you've gone through the installation process, you'll see sort of the last message that's given to you is a URL. As we had with the previous video, things like Nginx, you'll want to go to that URL, put it in your browser, and you'll be presented with a login page. You need to log in using the credentials you created on the installation, and then you'll be presented with the Proxmox screen. Now the screen I've got up is part of my Proxmox cluster. We'll get onto that later, but a cluster in Proxmox is simply when you have more than one physical node. So if you ignore all of the virtual machines I've got running on there, what I wanted to do is show you sort of what the user interface will look like on a live machine. So as you can see in front of you, I have two nodes, Proxmox Asus, which is a small Xeon workstation board that's about 5 or 6 years old. I managed to put that together for about £200. I'm sure our friends across the pond, you can do this even cheaper. I've seen your eBay prices and I'm very jealous. But it's just a 4-core hyperthread, so you get 8 cores you can assign within Proxmox. It has 32 gigs of RAM and one cheap NVMe drive. As you can see, it's been happily singing away for sort of, 46 days. The RAM's at about 70%, so I'm probably coming to the limit of my available RAM. And in future, if I'm going to put more on here, I like to keep a bit of overhead, sort of 20%, 30% feels about right. You'll see that the CPU usage is pretty flat. So, as I said, you can get some of this old kit, and the containers that you're likely going to run don't require a lot of compute power unless you're actively using them, or unless they're doing things like video transcoding or sort of computation in the background, number crunching, etc. They typically will idle away at sort of 20%. And if you look at what I'm running on here, this node is part of my Kubernetes cluster. It's my other physical node, which is giving me that high availability. My Proxmox Dell node does most of the heavy lifting. That has 40 cores, 128 gigs of RAM. But should that fail, everything should fail over onto this machine, including, as you'll see on the left hand side, my XG, which is my firewall. That will also fail over. So in the event of my Dell server going offline, not only have I got all of my virtual machines on there, my Kubernetes cluster's still up and running, my internet still works, which keeps the family happy, and I'll give you some brownie points. We'll cover all of that in a later video, but for now, let's get into installing our first virtual machine. Now, I mentioned in the last video that the Docker VM you have running in your Hyper-V can simply be migrated into your Proxmox environment. Now, I recommend you go and create a new virtual machine, and I'll get onto that in a minute and walk you through it. But there will be other times when you want to import a virtual machine, specifically on the Sophos XG installation, where they provide you with not an ISO, but a handy hard disk image. So it's really quick to spin that up. So the first thing we're going to want to do to migrate Hyper-V over to Proxmox is to go to your Hyper-V manager. you want to stop the virtual machine that's running. You want to look at the checkpoints and make sure you delete all of the checkpoints. Now, that sounds scary, but deleting the checkpoint merges it. So it basically brings up the latest snapshot and bakes it into the hard drive image. Therefore, you only have one image and it's the most recent. Otherwise, if you don't do this, when you export it, you'll have lots of incremental little hard drive files and you can't import that in Proxmox. So when you delete those snapshots, you'll end up with a single virtual hard drive image. I think it's .vdx file for Hyper-V. Now what you need to do, you need to export that somewhere safe. You need to load up your WinSCP as we did in the last video. You want to follow exactly the same procedure, but this time you want to create a new site. You want to connect to your Proxmox IP address and you want to log in. Now, I'll show you on screen, you need to navigate to a certain folder. This is the folder that I use. This folder won't be present on yours, but feel free to create it. It's exactly the same way we created the folder for Nginx in the previous video. And we simply want to drag and drop the exported virtual hard drive image onto our Proxmox node. Once that's copied, we need to create a new virtual machine. To do that, click Create VM in the top right hand corner. It's the blue button. This will create a pop-up. On that pop-up, you will have the node name. In this case, you should only have one node. Mine's set to Proxmox ASUS. You'll have a VM ID that's pre-populated. This number is important for the command you're going to run next time, so do take note. Don't worry if you don't take note, it will be displayed on the left hand side as you could see in my video. Typically the first one you create will start with 100. You can then give the virtual machine a name. You may want to call this one Docker. Once you've done that, click Next, which will take you onto the OS tab. As we're going to be importing a hard drive with an operating system that's already installed, we don't need to install an OS. So click Do Not Use Any Media and click Next. For the system, leave everything as default. We'll come onto this later when we create a new VM about what those options mean. For disks, keep it as is. You can alter the size if you wish. For the CPU, change this to the number of cores that you want to assign to the virtual machine. If you only have one socket, like most of your consumer grade gear will have, then leave that as 1. For network, leave the defaults for now. You can always change that later. And then hit finish. You'll see on the left hand side now that you have a new VM populated. It will have a grey question mark, and then after a few seconds it should turn to a grey computer screen. You're now ready to go to the console and import the VM to the virtual machine that you just created. Once completed, go to the hardware tab on that virtual machine you created. Click on the hard drive and click edit, and you want to assign that to SCSI 0. Once you've assigned that, click on the options, and then you want to change the boot device to use that hard drive you just created. Once that's done, simply click start, and you should have a fully operational virtual machine exactly the same as though it was running in Hyper-V. Okay, so let's get on to the bit that you're probably most excited for. Let's go and create our first VM in Proxmox. The process is pretty much identical to what we just did with the disk import. We need to create a VM first. This is the template by clicking in the top right hand corner. However, now that we're creating a new virtual machine, I want to take you through a few more of the options and explain what some of them actually mean. One thing to note, create CT. Now those are separate things. Those create Linux containers. We're not going to go into that in this session, but do be aware that they exist, and we'll have a think about why they might be useful. So when you click Create VM, you're presented with the first page of the wizard. Complete this in the same way that you did for importing the VM previously. On the next page, you start to select the operating system. So in this case, you would select where it's stored. So you'd collect the storage. As you can see, mine defaults to the TrueNAS. So I've actually got my TrueNAS mounted into Proxmox, so I can use that for ISO storage. which is really useful, and we can touch on that later if you want to go down that route. Next, you select the ISO image. So this is very similar to what we did in Hyper-V. So let's go and click the drop down. Oh wait, it's empty. Well, that's right, it's a fresh installation. We haven't put an ISO on there. Well, if we go and look at the storage on the node and click on the ISO tab, we'll see that it's blank. However, you'll see two options. What's really handy is we can download directly from the URL. So if you click download from the URL, you could go to the Ubuntu server website. You could right click the download now button, copy the URL and simply paste it into the top bar, hit query, and you'll get the file name, and then you'll just click download. It will go and download that in the background. Once it's done, that'll then be able to be selected from the previous VM creation wizard. However, because we downloaded the ISO in the previous video, there's a quicker way. And you'll notice the button next to it says upload. So if you click upload, simply select the ISO file that we downloaded previously. That will then be uploaded to the Proxmox node at your network speed or hard drive speed or whatever your limiting factor is. So you should get well over 100 megs per second. When that completes, just simply close down the dialog box and go back to creating your VM. Fill in the same details as before, and now when you get to that OS tab, you'll be able to select your local storage, and then you should see the ISO file as an option. So simply click that and we can move on to the next step. You will notice that there is the guest OS type, and it will say Linux, and you've got options for I think Solaris and Windows. Now if you're going to deploy a Windows virtual machine on here, then obviously you would change that to be Windows. That opens up different kernel operations in the background, different parameters, and makes it smoother, more optimized for the environment that you're running. The next options are the system options. Now we're going to leave those all as the default because that will work for what we want to do. However, do note that Q35 is going to be used in future videos. Now Q35 is fundamentally different to the default CBIOS that we're going to use, and is recommended if you want to do hardware pass-through to virtual machines. We're not going to touch on that in this video, but it's something we will cover in later videos. The next window is going to give you your hard drive options, much like in Hyper-V. You can select how big you want to make that drive and where you want to store that drive. So in the event I've got here, I'm actually storing some of my slower virtual machines, the ones that don't need high input output. I store that on my TrueNAS server because I've got about 100 terabytes that I can use. On the next page, you'll see the CPU options. On the right hand side as well, importantly, you can change the type of processor. So what this effectively means is you're telling the virtual machine effectively what hardware it can use. So for example, CPUs will have a number of hardware accelerators built into them, instruction sets, etc. Depending on what you select, allows the VMs to take advantage of those, which can greatly speed up certain computational tasks. What I recommend you do for this is if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see host, and what that will do is it'll give that virtual machine all of the instructions on your CPU. So it will basically give it full functionality. Memory is pretty straightforward. You simply key in the amount of memory you want to give to the virtual machine. Network, we're not going to change anything from the default here because this will allow you to explore your network and access services. But in the future, we'll be coming back to here to make advanced changes to networking. We'll be putting in a bridge, and we'll actually be making sure we give it its own MAC address, its own IP address, and we'll also be touching on VLANs. So once you've gone to the next screen, you simply hit confirm and you're away. You'll see that on the left hand column, your new VM is being created. And when you click on that virtual machine, you'll be presented with the summary tab for that individual virtual machine. Again, you're going to see things like the CPU usage, the memory usage, the disk usage, etc. So one thing to check once you've created your virtual machine, if you just go to the options tab and you check the boot order, just make sure that the SCSI 0 drive is selected as your first, so that's your hard drive. If it is, you're good to go. and you can simply go to the console option in the menu. If you click that, that's the same as in Hyper-V where we clicked connect, and you can launch the virtual machine by clicking start now. You can also, in sort of the upper right corner near where we created a VM, there's also separate menu options there for starting, stopping, suspending, much like in Hyper-V. And there you have it. You have your Ubuntu server running in Proxmox. Now you can go ahead and reinstall Docker as you did before and spin up those services. In the next video, we're going to be discussing firewalls. I'm going to be talking about what they are, what purpose they serve, and why you should consider getting one. We'll need a firewall as we start to include more services on our Docker installation, and certainly when we're looking to expose those services to the internet. We'll want to make sure that they're on their own dedicated VLAN that is separate from our home trusted devices. And we'll also want to have a look at some of the security features that we can enable to make sure that any traffic that's coming in is filtered and scanned before it hits those boxes. We'll also need to be looking at putting them behind a proxy. But I'm getting ahead of ourselves. The next video is going to look at firewalls and what your options are. See you then.